Hello and welcome to Simcha, a celebration of life. I'm your host, Aaron Halevi. In today's show, we explore the history of the Jews of Japan, learn about the generous and kind prophet Elisha, and discover one of the most mysterious love stories in the Bible. In our series on righteous men of the Bible, Rabbi Liebenberg introduces us to the prophet Elisha. Elisha was a faithful disciple of the prophet Elijah, and through him learned the knowledge of God. As the successor to Elijah, he traveled the length and breadth of Israel, performing miracles and helping those in need, even if they didn't belong to his own people.
In the book of Kings, we are introduced to an incredible character, the prophet Elisha. The prophet Elisha was the main disciple of the prophet Elijah, but he was a different person, with a different personality altogether. In some ways, he's an enigma. He's a mysterious person. On the one hand, very, very kind. On the other hand, we see, specifically from one incident in the book of Kings, that he had quite a temper. Who exactly was Elisha, and what can we learn from him? Well, like his master Elijah, Elisha was an itinerant prophet. He did stay in a particular place, but he was always traveling around, particularly the northern province of Israel, where the 10 tribes lived. And this was a province that was full of idolatry and evil behavior. So Elisha had his work cut out for him, and he would go from place to place teaching people about God and his commandments and the proper way to live. But there's one aspect of Elisha that really stands out for us, and is something that we can learn from, and this is his incredible compassion. And we see this in a number of cases. The first case has to do with the poor widow. The book of Kings tells us that there was a particular widow who had been married to a prophet, and after his death, the creditors came and said, your husband owes an enormous amount of money. In fact, this was the prophet Obadiah, who had taken out loans from the son of the king of the northern province of Israel to feed hungry prophets. He was never able to pay off all of these debts, and he passed away, leaving this incredible debt to his family. The creditors came knocking at his door, the door of his wife, and said, either you pay up or we're taking your children as servants, and they can work for the rest of their lives if necessary. She was in a terrible state, and she knew that Elisha the prophet could help. So she went to Elisha, and Elisha said, tell me, do you have anything of value in your home? And she said, well, I do happen to have some olive oil. In those days, olive oil was a very, very precious and expensive commodity. So Elisha said, okay, go to all of your neighbors and ask them for utensils, for containers, as many as possible. And she went and she did that. She was aided by her children. Then Elisha came and said, now take that bottle of olive oil and pour it into a container, pour it into another container, pour it into another container. And she kept on doing this for hours and hours and hours. And miraculously, the olive oil never ran out. And suddenly she had containers full of olive oil, which she was able to sell and to pay off her debts. So he came to the assistance of the widow. We see that the compassion of Elisha went beyond his community, and in fact, even went to the enemy of the Israelites. There was a famous archer from the neighboring country of Aram whose name was Naaman. Naaman was a warrior. He was incredibly brave. He was a leader. But he was plagued with the disease of tsarat, of leprosy, and he was desperate to find a cure. In one of his raids into Israel, he had captured a young Israelite girl, and she said to her mistress, you know, why don't you tell your husband to go to Israel? There's a prophet. The prophet's name is Elisha. Go to Elisha and he'll find a cure. Well, that's exactly what Naaman did. There was a whole political debacle that went on, but ultimately he was able to come into the land and to come to Elisha and to ask him for a cure. Elisha was a humble man, and also he was not impressed by power and wealth. So he sent out his servant, Gehazi, and the servant said, all you need to do is to go into the river Jordan, to immerse yourself in the water, and you'll be okay. Well, Naaman was furious. The prophet didn't even come out and greet him. He thought there would be some type of a miraculous recovery that he would have to do, and all he was told was to go into the river Jordan. He was furious. But his soldiers calmed him down and said, you know what, give it a try, what have you got to lose? He went into the river Jordan, and he was cured. His skin came back as pure as a child. And he was so thankful to the prophet. He went to the prophet and he said, I'll do whatever you want me to do. And not only that, he said, I'm giving up idolatry. I'm going to believe now in the God of Israel. And I will pay you for what you've done for me. He was a very wealthy man. Elisha said, I won't take a penny. Because if I take any money, that cheapens the miracle. And I don't do it because I want money. I do it for the glory and the honor of God. Unfortunately, his student Gehazi went behind his back and took money, and in that way caused a desecration of God's name. But Elisha wouldn't hear of it. He wouldn't take a single penny. And this is the type of man that Elisha was. He wasn't into fame. He wasn't into recognition. He went out to the people rather than them coming to him. That was a sign of his humility and his incredible compassion. This is what we can learn from him. And compassion for everybody. Compassion for the poor, that poor widow who the creditors were coming to take her children. Compassion even for the wealthy, but people who were lacking. And compassion even for one's enemy, which of course is the hardest thing that a person can do. An enemy is somebody that we hate. And yet Elisha was prepared to help out even one of the enemies of the Jewish people at the time, even Naaman. Because if he could help him, he knew that by helping an enemy, you would be able to acquire a friend in future. This is the incredible legacy that we learn from the prophet Elisha.
The history of the Jewish community in Japan goes back to 1861. Who would have thought that a small island located on the east of Asia would become a safe haven for Jews during the early years of the Holocaust? Hugh Raichlin takes us on a journey through Jewish Japan.
The first Jews came to Japan in 1861. So that's about 7 or 8 years after Japan had opened its borders to the West. About 50 families went to Japan, and they went to a place called Yokohama. In the early 1880s, a further 100 families went to the city of Nagasaki, and we know that that place became famous, unfortunately, for the atom bomb that was dropped by the Americans to end Second World War. But about 100 families came in 1881. As I understand it, one of the main reasons for the migration of the Jews coming into Japan from 1900 to 1950, and this might have been true of the first migrations in the 1860s and 1880s, was because Jews were there looking for economic opportunities, and also what was important for them was that they would have freedom of religion in order to practice their culture. What is fascinating about Japan is that, and this is not a phrase of my own, I've heard others using it, that people talk about a godless Japan. It is a country which does not have any of the Western concepts of God, of a single omnipotent God, and they don't have any holy texts. So when Jews and when the Christians of the West went across to Japan, they found a country which was entirely different to anything else that they had ever experienced. The next major migration to Japan was in 1941, and that was a very unique migration, and that was as a result of a true hero by the name of Chiune Sugihara, who was the Japanese consul in Kovna in Lithuania in 1940-1941. And that was just before the Germans were going to come into Lithuania and place it under their control and would lead to the demise, ultimately, of the Lithuanian Jewish community. And he and his wife Yukiko noticed many Jewish refugees, and they were mainly Polish refugees, which also consisted of the Mira Yeshiva, boys of the Mira Yeshiva that had come across, that had been running away from the Germans. They came over the Polish border into Lithuania. And in 1941, a number of Jews devised a strategy which, if it would have the help of the Japanese consul in Kovna, would enable them to flee, would enable them to have a valid exit visa to leave Lithuania and to escape. And for several days, many hundreds of Jewish refugees waited outside the consulate. And eventually the ambassador came to talk to them, or rather the consul came to talk to them, and asked them what was the issue. And they said to him that if he would give them an exit visa, they would be able to get an entrance visa into Curacao in America. And that would enable them to leave Lithuania. He cabled Japan 3 times, and the Japanese government remained silent and did not give him authority. Chuene Sugihara of blessed memory and his wife Yukiko took it on themselves to write out passports by hand, write out exit visas. As a result, 6,000 Jews left Lithuania, including the whole Mir Yeshiva, and went to Kobe in Japan. And from Kobe in Japan, they went to Shanghai in China, where they survived the war, and from there went to Israel and America and many other places. 40,000 Jews are alive in the world today as a result of the actions of the Sugiharas in Kovna. Today there are about 1,000 Jews that live in Japan. There are no real ethnic Jews as such, other than those that may have remained from the early emigres that came in the 1800s or the late 1900s. The Jewish community today is mainly comprised of Jewish businessmen and families that have migrated purely for economic purposes. However, we were entertained and we spent a Shabbat with the Chabad of Japan, and I must say that Chabad have been an amazing organization, helping those of us that travel the globetrotters, to find a place where you can spend Shabbat and have a kosher meal. Mendy and Chana Sudakevich are the Chabad Rabbi and Rebbetzin over there, and we had a most wonderful Shabbos with kosher food in Japan. When we went to Kyoto, we went to a church started by Father Takeji Otsuki, arising out of a vision that he had in Manchuria when he was there in 1938. And in his dream, he dreamt that he had a duty to pray for the peace of Israel, to pray for the redemption of the Jewish people, that they should go to Israel, to pray for peace in Israel, the Holy Land, and to pray that the Mashiach, that the Messiah, should come soon in our days. He then had a following of many Japanese that accepted this vision that he had as being a duty on them to pray for the Jewish people, that all of those things that I enumerated above should take place. And when we visited the community of Father Takeji Otsuki, it was so beautiful to see a big flag of Israel next to the flag of Japan with a photograph of Mr. Tatsuki on the wall. And what we then saw was something that none of us expected. First of all, the current leader of the organization studied in Israel and speaks an absolute fluent Hebrew. And there were many in the group that could not follow everything because his Hebrew was just so good and he was so articulate. And afterwards, we were treated to a concert of these beautiful Japanese people, men and women, singing Yerushalayim Shel Zahav and singing the most beautiful Hebrew songs with such feeling. We sometimes see on the news and on television Japanese people standing in the streets of Tokyo and other places being filmed showing their support for Israel. I have no doubt that many or most of those people come from this church of Father Otsuki. As we know, wherever Jews travel in the world, they build a synagogue. And the reason is that that is a central meeting place because Judaism rests upon the idea of family and community. And as far as Japan goes, there are the 2 Chabad houses in Tokyo. I mentioned the one of Rabbi Sudakevich. And other than that, there are 2 synagogues in Japan. The one is in Kobe, called Ohel Shlomo, which was built in the 1970s. But the tradition of that synagogue is Sfaradi, not Ashkenazi, And the reason for that is, as I mentioned earlier, there was a migration between 1900 to 1950 of Jews from various parts of the world, and included in that was a migration from Iraq and Syria. And amongst that group were the Sassoon family, and they had a very strong influence on the community. As a result, the synagogue over there follows the tradition of the Sfaradim, which is the Middle Eastern tradition of prayer and heritage. The other synagogue in Japan is the Beth David synagogue in Tokyo, and that was built in 1968. And over there where the synagogue was, when it was inaugurated, one of the people that gave a speech said in his speech that who would imagine that at the furthest point of the diaspora, right on the east of the world, on the eastern edge of the world, so to speak, where there are so few Jews, that the Jews would get together and build a synagogue in Japan and in Tokyo. And he said that the reason that we do it is for our children, that we want them to understand their heritage, and we want Judaism to continue, that wherever Jews are in the world, that they should be able to transmit to the next generation that they have a proud heritage that they follow, that they will uphold their customs and their laws and be able to pass it on until one day all the Jews will be reassembled and come back to the Holy Land of Israel in the Middle East.
Welcome back. The story of Tamar is a bittersweet one. In our segment on Righteous Women of the Bible, Rebbetzin Knopf explains how the sadness of events within Tamar's life did not leave her despondent and forlorn, but rather propelled her to look deep within herself for justice and happiness.
Judah had 3 sons, and he was looking for a marriage partner for his oldest son, Er. He saw Tamar and thought it was a suitable match. They then married. After some time, God saw Er as an evil man and killed him. So Tamar was left a widow who was childless. So Judah offers his second son to Tamar in a levirate marriage. This means that any child coming from this marriage is on behalf of the late husband. Onan didn't like this idea of having a child on behalf of his brother, and therefore would spill his seed on the ground in order not to impregnate Tamar. This was seen as evil in the eyes of God, and God killed him. Poor Tamar is now left a widow for the second time. Judah tells Tamar to go back to her father's house, and then he will give her his third and final son. Even though Tamar didn't know the future, she had such a strong internal knowing that a child had to be born from the tribe of Judah that would continue into great things, and she decided to make it her mission for that to be possible. Tamar became a woman on a mission. She heard that her father-in-law, Judah, had just lost his wife, and he was on the way to a place called Timnah to shear his sheep. And then he wandered off into the roads, and at a crossroad he met a prostitute. He asked to lie with her. She, in return, asks what he would give her in order to lie with her. He says a sheep, but he had no sheep on him. So she asks, well, how can I confirm that you're going to give me this sheep? He asks, what would you like? And she says, I would like your stamp, your cloak, and your staff. And when you give me the sheep, I will return them to you. So he gives her these 3 items. A union happens, and she is impregnated by Judah. Judah didn't know that it was actually Tamar who'd taken off her widowed clothes and put on a veil and pretended to be a prostitute. After this union, Tamar went back to her father's house and redressed as a widow. Judah needed to fulfill his promise to the prostitute, so he sent his farmer off with a sheep to find her, to give her the sheep as promised and have the 3 items returned: his stamp, his cloak, and his staff. When the farmer went to find the prostitute, there was no prostitute there. He asked the local village men, "Is there a prostitute who stands by the crossroad?" They knew nothing of it. So Judah's farmer went back with the sheep to Judah and explained to him there was no prostitute there, and he hasn't got his 3 belongings, that he couldn't return them, and the sheep still remains with them. 3 months pass, and the word got out that Tamar is pregnant. Judah was furious. He's not yet given his 3rd son, Shelah, for her to marry. So he came to the conclusion that she must have become a prostitute and got pregnant in an illegitimate way. Tamar was then sent to Judah's house and was told when she arrived that she was going to be burnt and killed. She was horrified, she was upset, but she knew there was nothing she could do. She had to go, even 3 months pregnant. So she goes to her father-in-law's house, Judah, and says, "I have these 3 items. Whoever these 3 items belong to is the one who impregnated me. Does anyone know who they belong to?" Judah couldn't believe it. They were his items. He was the one who impregnated his daughter-in-law. A righteous man, Judah, had fell to this kind of immorality. The sages actually say that in the normal circumstance, he wouldn't have done that. But you can imagine he was feeling quite low at the time. And also it says that God kind of pushed him towards this union, just like Tamar was forced into this union as well. And this one time happened, and she's now pregnant. In the end, Tamar gave birth to twin boys. The eldest, the one that came first, was called Peretz. And he did, after all, end up being the great-great-grandfather of King David that carried on through to the Messianic line. How powerful a woman, a righteous woman, who's in despair, she has no child to carry on the offspring of Judah. And Judah, feeling low at the time where he's just lost his wife. 2 people that in normal circumstances would never end up lying together. But this whole stream of events had to happen for this union to happen in order for these children to be born. The message of this is that even if you come from divorced parents, or you've been raised by a single mother, or you don't even know your biological parents, just know you had to be born with these 2 parents, with these 2 bodies and these 2 souls in order for you to be created at this particular time. So instead of walking around like a victim in a so-called conventional society, you can use this story to feel empowered because you had to be born in that way in order to fulfill your mission. So take this story and take strength from it and know that from you can come greatness, and even more greatness can come from the generations that will be coming through you.
Well, that's all we have for this week's episode of Simcha, a celebration of life. As always, we'd love to hear from you, so please send us a message on Facebook at Spirit Sister Productions. From me, Aaron Halevi, and the Simcha team, have a wonderful week ahead.